Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer, and this is the Healing Souls podcast. I am so excited to have really a dear friend and colleague with me tonight. I have Mandy, Lynn, Danzig, who is a social worker, a musician, an activist based here in Salt Lake City. She is currently the director of the HIV case management and behavioral health consulting at the University of Utah's Infectious Disease Clinic and is very passionate about eradicating HIV, as many of us are. So that's awesome that she's doing that work. She's an award-winning multi-instrumentalist and songwriter who has toured the US and is also a passionate activist for LGBTQIA rights and climate justice. And she currently performs a live show on her Facebook page, which I will be sharing here. It's facebook.com/MandyLynnDanzig every weekday morning during the pandemic. She's currently wrapped up episode 155. And it's a treat to watch her do that. I know I haven't listened to all 155 of them, but I've listened to several. It's always beautiful, Mandy. So that's so
hopefully
generous.
No one's done all of them. Yes.
So, and then the last piece is that Mandy is a transgender woman and has been recently going through a transition in her own gender identity over, I would say, the last 3 or 4 years. Is that about correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're here to talk about a lot of intersectional spaces, what you have to offer professionally and musically and, personally. And, your story is a very interesting one. And I thought sharing it with a wider audience would only benefit many, many people in regards to just from an educational perspective, or many people who have possibly a transgender family member or friend and want to understand more about that, and or are possibly going through some type of coming out process themselves. So welcome to the show, Mandy. I'm so glad to have you.
Oh, thank you. I'm just really thrilled to be here. And aren't we all always coming out in some way, shape, or form?
Right? There's plenty of closets, plenty of reasons to be in a closet. So, for sure.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I would love to start just by letting you introduce yourself a little bit more. Tell us maybe a little bit about your background and your growing up years and kind of how you got into the profession that you did, and also maybe your musical background. So just, kind of start off with telling us about yourself.
Sure. Well, so I grew up here in Salt Lake City in a really pretty musical family. So my father was a member of the big choir here in town, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and also a folk singer. So, and also a pipe organ mechanic. So I had all this kind of wild music floating around me. And he was also, his parents were both Jewish immigrants, and so I had this really fascinating background here in Salt Lake that I think was kind of an interesting thing for me.
Not the typical like pioneer stock story of a lot of the Mormons here in Utah. Is that correct?
Well, my mom's side was very similar to that. And then my dad, the story was, well, we were fleeing the pogroms in Russia, and that's how we got to the U.S. And so it was a very interesting mix. And also I was raised by him very much to value kind of the Jewish instinct of asking questions, like questioning everything and comparing all the rabbis' opinions and deciding which one I felt most comfortable with. So that was in the milieu when I was young. I went to school to become a musician. I wanted to be a composer. And about the time I was graduating, I had gotten married and had 2 children, and I started noticing there aren't many jobs for composers in a really big way. And so I thought about it for a couple of years, and I'd always been really interested in mental health. So I went back and got a graduate degree in social work and became an LCSW. My first practice was in a small town in Utah, kind of doing all the counseling for all the people there. It was a really fascinating job. And then eventually wanted to get back to music as well, and kind of embraced my folk singer roots. And so my wife and I started a band. Even though my father was Jewish, he had converted to the Mormon Church. So I grew up very LDS. And at some point I realized, oh, I can't, I'm not comfortable with my religion, how it's handling LGBTQ issues. And so I started speaking out about that. And I guess caught myself in a little bit of hot water with LDS Church authorities. And so once I was in hot water, I figured I might as well just heat it all the way up, and did a whole bunch of activism. And then toured the US as a musician, landed in Salt Lake kind of doing HIV work, and short stint for a few years in between that as primarily a children's and adolescent therapist as well. So just all sorts of wonderful things mixed into my life. And then, not quite a year ago, I came out publicly as a transgender woman. So that's kind of the broad arc of
the broad arc, right? Okay, well, let's go.
The heap of stuff I've done.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Let's go back to that juncture where you're talking about becoming more of an LGBTQIA activist, within your community, which, in a conservative religious community, that doesn't always go very well. So tell me a little bit about what you think motivated that for you. Was it primarily your kind of insights as a social worker and kind of becoming more social justice minded as you studied that profession? Was it more personal? What was driving that motivation?
It was very much my career at the time. I hid my identity from myself really, really well. And maybe I think at some point I'd love to talk about that tonight. But to answer your question here, I wasn't aware that I was a queer person at all, but I was a social worker. And while I was getting my education, I had this thought, like, I was just looking at statistics, and I thought, I'm going to see a lot of gay people, was my initial thought. They're going to come in and ask me for help, and what am I going to tell them? And I really got worried about that. And so I studied a whole bunch. It's an issue. My education was here in Salt Lake City at the University of Utah, which the student body of the program was 60 to 80% LDS. So this was an issue back when I was getting my education, the very early 2000s, that sort of everyone was really struggling to talk about. And so they'd show us a few videos and then hope we didn't beat each other up, in class. And so I thought, I'm not getting the education that I need to treat clients. And so I really did a lot of my own research and became very quickly convinced that the religion I was in was not listening to the lived experiences of its queer membership. That something was very wrong is what I was seeing, that people were being hurt and abused and abandoned. And so I got really interested in changing that. And obviously sometimes I guess I'm a person who's pretty quick to change and institutions are very slow to change. But that was my impetus, was about doing good treatment for individuals, good, competent, moral and ethical social work treatment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit about the pushback that you got, that you're saying, you didn't feel like the church authorities were very pleased with your advocacy work? How public were you being? How much reach did you have?
Well, I was a fairly new social worker at the time. I was working down on the very edge. So I'm a musician, and I also played in the orchestra at Temple Square, like the orchestral component to the big Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And I lived just barely close enough to Salt Lake City in this rural job I was doing to commute up and do that. And one of the things that really bothered me was that there was sort of a de facto idea that you were being a musical missionary, like proclaiming the faith. And it really bothered me that the LDS Church was so politically active in oppressing LGBTQ minorities. And so I felt like I had a moral obligation to say, hey, I'm playing in this orchestra, but that's not how I see this. So those were kind of the two places I spoke from. One was from my professional credentials, and the second was just saying, and I love music, right? And I love this spirituality through music, but also I don't agree with this oppression. I felt like I should be able to walk a line there where I didn't have to be seen as supporting that. I didn't see how I could, in good conscience, have a client come into me without having made it clear that I was a safe person. So yes, I got asked to quit playing in the orchestra immediately. I wrote a letter to the editor just saying, I really disagree with this political push of the LDS Church, because that's where I actually felt they had overstepped their bounds, right? Like, it's voluntary to be in a church, but they had asked for the church to take members to take political action to oppress LGBTQ minorities. And so that really disturbed me, and I felt like I had to say something. And apparently that's not something that's wanted inside that organization. So I found myself kind of outside that organization fairly quickly, just in time to be a person in Salt Lake who was positioned. I don't think there were many people. It's a very scary thing to be in a town where the majority, there's a majority religion that is, more than half the people in the state belong to. And then to possibly have a view that's contrary to that. They have a lot of power. And so there weren't a lot of people who were super comfortable doing activism in Salt Lake proper at that time. And the LDS Church was just going into Proposition 8. And I had done a bunch of research and saw that, 24% of active members of the LDS Church disagreed with their church on this stand. I was like, where is that 1 in 4 people? I don't hear them talk. I don't hear their views represented in church meetings. I don't see them feeling free to speak. And so I was really passionate about empowering that 1 in 4 people who, understood the issue, who had a queer person in their family, who cared passionately about this and did not want to see this type of painful destruction wrought. I was really passionate about empowering that voice to be heard. And I think it was useful because there really weren't very many people who felt comfortable openly advocating for that in Salt Lake. A lot of the people we collaborated with were in California or Boston, areas with a more liberal mindset. So I lost track of what you asked me.
No, I love it. I do that all the time too, Mandy. No, I think that it's exactly right. Like, what was the advocacy like? And when you talk about people, where is that 1 in 4 voices? This is oftentimes what happens in groups, is that the majority voice will very much silence the minority voice, and especially a majority groups that, rely a lot on conformity and maybe, some of these dynamics that kind of keep voices silenced. Because, like, as you said, as you became more vocal, you paid a price for that, right? You paid a price. You were no longer able to participate in this, musical space that you had enjoyed. You were no longer maybe welcome to participate in some of the church's rituals or, traditions and things of that nature. So it's hard. You're absolutely right. That is scary when, that's your whole community, or that's your family, or that's your, job security, right? Like, if you're, I don't know, a dentist.
That was the frightening thing down.
Or a therapist.
That was the very frightening thing down in Levan, where I lived. The stake president that I talked to sort of hinted that he might tell. He was the stake president over half the people in the area I served, and he sort of hinted that he might need to tell them I was a dangerous counselor. And so how is that going to work for me to hold a position where, 70% of the people are being told they shouldn't come see me? I'm also the only person there. So it's super difficult scenario where, like, well, I'm the only person to do this job. Well, one of two, and then how will I be able to do it if people are being told I'm dangerous? It just was a really difficult situation. It's one of the reasons I moved back to Salt Lake, was really just wrestling with all of that. And then once I had already paid the price, I thought, well, here I am, nicely positioned to understand the issue. I have lots of friends, and I can maybe make a little bit of a difference. Yeah.
Well, and that, we won't talk about this much tonight, but in essence, what you're bringing up is the ethics, that people who are in mental health professions, we have ethical codes, to treat all kinds of mental health and, psychological conditions, from best standards of care with, evidence-based treatments. Transgender issues are definitely part of that treatment. There are best standards of care that the health department has put out, that several associations have put out, that have taken a ton of research and best thinking to have those things come forward. And then you have religious communities that are basically saying, if you follow best standards of care, within our community, you're going to be considered dangerous, or we're not going to refer people to you. Or we're going to, only adhere to counselors who are not willing to, in essence, adhere to their ethical codes, because there are therapists as well that will kind of go against their own ethical codes in order to choose their own religious beliefs and practices. This is an issue that I have been very passionate about for about,
Yes.
20 years. And so it's maddening to me. It's this seems so clear in medical positions, right? Like if you have a doctor who doesn't believe that cancer treatments are from God or something, like that wouldn't be very tolerated in the medical community, and it wouldn't be very tolerated actually in most even religious communities, right? But when it comes to mental health conditions, and especially those that have to do with some sense of sexuality, we run into a lot of these types of ethical cross points that are really unhealthy. And like this community that you were serving really missed out from having a competent, ethically minded, evidence-based therapist serving within their community. They basically ran you off. That's tragic.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean,
a little bit.
It's a difficult thing, right? Like, because I think powerful structures, especially organizations and power structures that can't be questioned, almost always, in my mind, perpetrate abuses. And then when there's a further effort to keep people silent about what's happening, to silence people's stories. And that's one of the things that also was a really big awakening for me working in rural Utah, was discovering just how damaging it was to a lot of people. There was this belief that sexual behavior outside of marriage was a sin, and that sexual behavior inside of marriage wasn't. But there were all these women who were being raped by their husbands. And so the powers that be were saying, well, that's okay. And, as a counselor, I have to be, no, that's absolutely not okay. That's illegal. You can't force yourself on somebody, even if you're married to them. You don't own their body. And then on the flip side, I would meet with especially young women who had been through sexual abuse, and as a result of that are revisiting that in their teenage years, and are very often sexually active, and are then stigmatized when they go to a church leader to talk about the experiences they're having. They're told they're shameful and dirty, and this is actually a sequela of previous sexual abuse, right? Like, so it's almost as if they're being punished, as if they're being told they're the cause of their own unworthy, like this thing that it's just a horribly damaging message. So I was also awakening to all of those dynamics. Probably I would have got myself in trouble about something else eventually. Because I think the ethics of the profession, while they're so similar to the ethics of, say, Christian religion or the Mormons, right, which is, I think a deep respect and compassion for the creation of a person, right? And a deep desire to be compassionate and nurturing, right? But then there were these areas where the ideas of how to go about that healing were so very different.
Correct, right. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned other religions, because even though your experience is in Utah, my experience has been over the last, decade and a half in Wichita, Kansas, where it's very, the Bible Belt, very evangelical, very Christian, and same dynamics, right? Same dynamics that I would see. I've also spent quite a bit in Wisconsin and kind of country rural Wisconsin, where there's a lot of German Protestant background, and again, similar dynamics in regards to these kinds of issues of religious play with mental health and sexuality. And so that's always fascinating. But okay, so moving on.
You're right.
Yeah. I would love to go back to what you just talked about, your own identity awakening, right? So I don't know if you want to share necessarily how old you are or whatever, but a lot of times I think people have this sense, there's a lot of confusing ideas, I think, around the trajectory of a gender identity awakening. Some people are like, well, you're only transgender, quote unquote, if you're aware of that as a very small child, right? Or you're only transgender if you're old enough to understand the implications of gender identity, right? So those are kind of two extremes, right? And help fill in the education, mixed in with your own personal identity of just the challenges of even considering gender identity consciously versus subconsciously, et cetera.
Well, this is something I'm passionate about, right? Like, because the narrative I grew up hearing is a very cisgender narrative, which is, I always knew, from the time I was little, I knew I was this gender, and it wasn't what everyone else was telling me, and I insisted, and finally someone listened to me, or I listened to myself, and I made this transition, right? But the truth is so much more complicated. We've talked about all this activism I did, and at the time, I thought I was a cisgender, white, heterosexual male, right? Like, and that's what everyone else thought I was. Now, true, I'd always had a deep sense that something was very different about me, and honestly, I think due to internalized transphobia, like that something was very wrong with me. I couldn't put my finger on. And I think for me, a key concept here is that gender is a subconscious thing. We all have a subconscious gender, and we very rarely need to confront that, right? A cisgender person very rarely bumps into something that says, hey, something feels weird about this gender thing that you bumped into. Looking back, I see all gender things felt weird to me, right? Like, all the gender things felt weird to me, but you can't think about what you have no words to talk about and you have no images to show you about, right? Like, so I grew up in a culture, a very sheltered culture, where I never saw, as a child, I never saw images of anything but cisgender heterosexuality. The closest I saw to a transgender woman was Klinger on MASH. Well, I knew it wasn't Klinger on MASH. Good heavens, Klinger was a guy, right? Like, I wasn't a guy. I wasn't a guy who wanted to wear women's clothing. In fact, I very much repressed that urge, didn't I? I was very much aware that I had, at the time, how I was thinking, that I was a guy with a lot of feminine qualities. That if I did a sand tray on myself, that the main character was always a woman, right? That the people I identified with in movies were the heroines, right? Like, this was something I sort of noticed and was a little mystified by. Even in graduate school, the education about transgender identities really was not particularly good, right? The story I got was they always know from the time they're little. What I found out entering the transgender community as an out transgender person is there are a lot of people who don't know until they're older. The best book on the subject right now, the best treatment guide, is called Transgender Emergence, because your gender identity, if it doesn't match the cisgender norms, has to emerge from your subconscious. It's okay if I launch into a little lecture about how gender identity is formed?
I would love it.
Okay, because I think this is such an interesting subject. So as near as we can tell, here's one of the funny things for me. It's like, we talk about our sex organs and we always leave the brain out. But, I'm pretty sure the brain is a sex organ, right? Where does all that excitement come from, right? Like, it has to go through the brain. And so the brain is gendered in general. Now we're beginning to understand that there's a whole spectrum of how the brain is gendered. You could be cisgender, meaning everything's super clear to us. Your sex organs and your secondary sex characteristics and your subconscious gender, all of these things match up perfectly, and nobody asks any questions, and you just feel comfortable from day one. Or it could be somewhere in the middle. Your brain could be somewhere in the middle. Or, like in my case, I think my brain's pretty far over here on the femme side, right? But and so what happens is you're born. And as near as we can tell about gender, what most of the research is showing is that as humans, we're born kind of earlier than other animals. This is really important for us because we have a lot more social connections. Like, Like the environment around us, the social environment around us is vital to our survival. And that's not something you can program in the womb. So we're born early, and then we have this chance to wire our brains for the society we live in. And anyone who's been somewhere else and had culture shock understands that, like, culture shock is a thing because your brain's wired for a different culture. It's shocking to be in a new one. So what we have is a child that's born, and as near as we understand gender, it's wired during this early formative time. And it's very much an imprinting sort of thing. So if you look at little ducks, right, they imprint on their mother. And you can hotwire that. You can have them imprint on a boot if you want, right? And then they'll follow the boot around. So it's not a conscious process. It's not a choice process. Your brain, which is set up to wire itself for a gender, then absorbs the gender norms from society. And it programs you, how should I react? What should I expect? What mannerisms should I adopt? How should I interact with this person versus that person? All of this is programmed into your brain, absorbed from the environment when you're very young. And then we begin to manifest a clear understanding of our gender, unless our gender doesn't really match society. And then you see parents providing extreme corrective measures, at least in the culture I grew up in. Hey, that's not acceptable for the gender that you are. Like, you have to behave this way. And so we try and police that where it doesn't match for whatever reason. Our society, I think, unnecessarily has this binary view of gender. You're either this or this, and there's a lot of space in between the two. And so it's subconscious, so you don't actually have words to think about it. Maybe I could talk a little bit about my first inkling of true awakening. It was my first round of therapy. I was in graduate school. I was finally loosening up on the very conservative background that I had grown up in, and I thought, I'll start watching some movies that maybe I wouldn't have watched before because I would have been so scared of what might happen in that movie, right? And so for the very first time in my life, I saw a movie that portrayed a lesbian relationship. It was just a subplot, and there was this very lovely, passionate kiss. That was about as steamy as it got. And I was really startled by this, and I couldn't shake the idea in my head for days afterward that I was a lesbian. I kept thinking, I'm a lesbian. And then I would say, well, now how can that be, right? You've got to be a woman to be a lesbian, right? Like, so that doesn't make sense, right? Like, I had no words to say to myself, you could be a woman, and being a lesbian would make a lot of sense, right? Like, I had just, for the first time in my life, for the first time ever, I had seen an open relationship between two women, and my mind had said, that is who you are. That's how you function. But so imagine that you get the instruction book for your life, and when you open it to see what your relationships are going to be like, everything is blacked out. There are no pictures that make sense to you at all. All the pictures are confusing. There are things that don't resonate with you. And there are no pictures you resonate with. So there are no words for what you feel. And there's no context for what's going on inside of you. So this also is an extremely traumatic way to grow up. I mean, take, for instance, an experience I had as a young girl. I'm with my mother going to the gym. I'm probably about 4 years old. And she's taking me to go swimming, and it's just her and me. And so, of course, she takes me into the women's dressing room with her. And that seemed natural and easy, and it had happened dozens, maybe 100 times. You know, we loved swimming. And all of a sudden, one day, a woman walked up and pointed at me and said, he is too old to be in here. You should not bring him with you, and started yelling at my mother about how I had to be out of there. And it was terrifying to me. I didn't understand why that was so terrifying to me until I finally reconciled that, well, I'm a woman, and here I am in a woman's changing room being told that I have to go to the other place, the place with all the people who aren't like me, right? Like, this is a terrifying thing. Or in junior high, when I'm in PE, oh my, yikes. And they send me into a locker room, junior high, they send this 12, 13-year-old girl into a locker room with a bunch of boys and insist that she get naked and go shower with them. Like, there was nothing more. I mean, this is hugely traumatic to me, and I couldn't understand why it was so traumatic. It was deeply embarrassing that I was so frightened of these experiences, but I had no words to talk about what I was feeling or what I was thinking. If I could have said to myself, well, I'm a girl, and that's why I'm scared of this, I would have at least had a way to think about it. But I was just blindly and utterly terrified. So there wasn't a way to ask for help either, because none of it made any sense. So I think it was a huge failing of my graduate education that the only story I got about transgender individuals was that they knew since they were little kids, and I hadn't known since I was a little kid. And so I think most transgender individuals don't really know when they are little kids. A lucky few do, but so many of us are mystified about our lives, super confused. And also, at a very young age, we get kind of harshly beat into hiding that part of ourselves. I learned never to think about it. And this has taken me a long time to undo. A kind of surprising thing for me is, as I've been in therapy, is to realize that I have these moments where my mind just goes blank, right? Like, I taught myself to erase what I was thinking about, so that I wouldn't have to know things that were hard to deal with. So it's hard to know something that you have no words for, and it's also very difficult to think about something that you're trained from the time you were an infant to never think about. You're trained out of that as quickly as possible. So finally, I did all my work around homosexuality. I said to myself, is there any possibility I'm gay? Lots of people are gay. Lots of people are bi. I should really question this. Am I just homophobic? Have I actually considered the prospect of a romantic relationship with another person of my same gender? And the answer was no. So I said, well, I should think about that, because how can I know if I haven't really thought about it? And then ironically, somehow, it never occurred to me to ever think about, have I thought about my gender? That's also a thing. Have I ever asked myself these questions? And indeed, no, I was deeply defended against asking them. Really, when I finally came truly and fully out to myself was when my oldest child came out to my wife and I as non-binary. And this was a term I hadn't heard before, because it's a fairly recent term that's been popping up, non-binary identity, somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. I wish there were better terms than I'm not on either end. That's pretty much all non-binary means, right? Like, I don't think it's very descriptive, It's like, I'm not the North Pole, I'm not the South Pole, right? Like, well, that's the rest of the earth. So I was looking on the internet. I was like, I need to educate myself. My kid just came out to me, and I need to understand this. And I hadn't thought of it as a transgender identity. I had just thought, well, kind of gender bendery, which I also identified myself as a kind of non-stand, like, I hated gender roles. So I thought I hated the male gender role. And it felt very stifling and painful. And so as I looked at this, I thought, well, for the first time ever, I said to myself, I really hate being a guy. I passionately hate it. I wonder if I'm non-binary. Like, I should maybe look at that. And I thought, well, I'll look at some pictures of non-binary people and see how that resonates with me. And it just didn't really resonate with me. And somehow in my searching, I ran across a whole page of transgender women before and after pictures. And it was a really startling thing for me, because in a flash, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm not non-binary. That's what I am. It was as clear as when I saw my first lesbian kiss. My mind said, that's who you are. And it was very interesting, because a lot of things in my life just suddenly, it was like that change in perspective. And I was like, oh, all these things I felt were so mysterious or so strange, or that I couldn't understand about myself, or that I've been in therapy for, 10 years working on, I was like, oh, they all make sense, right? Like, from this perspective, when I finally said to myself, are you possibly a woman? Everything made sense. And that was, at age 46. So So that's a long way through my life. It's not so common that a person is as defended against it as I am, that a person is that repressed. But it's also not so common that a person's clear from the time they're a little kid.
Right.
Anyway,
Wow.
that was a long
No,
story.
that's so much wonderful things to consider. I mean, I'm thinking about, where you started, where we are born earlier than other animals, so that these social connections are part of our wiring. And I think about, from a very, I was just in I don't know, a sex therapy webinar or something, and they were showing like the same baby, but dressed in boy clothes and dressed in girl clothes, right? These that we have. And they would show the pictures to the same people. So they didn't recognize that it was the same baby. They just said, describe this picture and describe this picture. And it was so interesting to see the amazingly different descriptions that they would offer this child, just in their verbiage and their gendered language, about that would project so much onto this child. So like you're saying, so much of this is happening at such an early age. And then the punishment that you mentioned, right? And I do believe that male-bodied boys get more punishment than female-bodied children, because for whatever reason, I guess maybe homophobic reasons, or culturally internalized homophobic and transphobic messages make it very difficult, I think, for male-bodied individuals to flirt with feminine ideas, whereas a female-bodied child can be a tomboy or can play basketball or softball and still for some reason fit in better than the reverse. Like if a male-bodied child wants to become a ballerina or or like a dancer or something along those lines. Would you agree with that, or am I?
Well, we have a society that stigmatizes, oppresses, and harasses feminine strength. And so I do think that's very true, right? Like everyone understands why a female-bodied person might want to move in a male-bodied direction. I think there's just this presumption of masculinity is better, right? And so it does, I think, the harshest kind of a program is reserved for males who abdicate maleness, right? Like that's always for a power structure based around masculine authority, for patriarchy. That's a frightening thing to see, that somebody might embrace a different type of strength than what they say is the strength that what creates strength, right? So I think that's very true. I mean, it's interesting. We look at all the professions that cater to the feminine sort of strength tend to be paid less. We have a whole society that's skewed away from that. So everyone can understand why someone might want to climb the ladder, and no one can understand why someone might want to descend that ladder. I mean, because we're thinking of it in hierarchical terms, which is so unfortunate, right? Like, what's going to save the world? The world needs a little more feminine strength here, right? Like, we need to be honoring the perspective of nurturing and protecting, and the types of strength that I think is seen as feminine. Men are seen so often, and these are broad paintbrushes. So, if I paint right over somebody's favorite thing, I apologize. But we've got this society that loves exploration, loves taking things by force, and loves robbing the future to bring back goods to the present. So we have that kind of thing running the show. And I think it's very frightening when someone says, well, hold on a minute, I think maybe I'd like to put my weight over here. It's confusing, it disturbs everyone. It's very much the same thing that, I guess, to draw an analogy, what happened to me inside of Mormonism was that I said, hey, something's not working here. There's something wrong. I want to talk about it because something's out of balance. It's not functioning. It's not sustainable. It's hurting people. And then, of course, that's frightening to a power structure that doesn't want to see that. And I think we have, in a broader sense, we have this sort of patriarchy and capitalist mindset, which capitalism is based on forever growth, right? It's not, and so we have to take from somewhere. We have to get stuff from someone else to have capitalism, right? Whether it's from someone else or from the future, we have to bring it into the present. And so I think that's very true what you said. Sorry, I wandered into a very philosophical realm with that.
No, that's fine. I think that it's understanding these kinds of, because philosophical realms are what we're swimming in, right? And so we have to kind of be somewhat aware of the philosophical realms that we're in. And it's hard to do that when you're in water and you're a fish and it works out for you versus, maybe a different being that isn't able to function underwater and is saying this isn't working, so, which I think is the case for many of our minorities, including, of course, transgender individuals.
Well, and I look at that, you've brought this up, if we could look at that as the canary in the coal mine, right? The individuals that are vulnerable to dangerous conditions are the first indicator that something is wrong with our society and we should pay attention. That's the person who doesn't fit in particularly well, that person's strength is that they can tell us there's something wrong with our society before those for whom it's functioning grand can. We should, one of the reasons to value diversity is that we'll get information to save ourselves before it's too late. And I think queer individuals are one of those indicators, right? Like, hey, and also then they are the voices that start to talk about, we might want to change this, right? Like, I don't want to run out of breath here in this mine that has toxic air. And I'm the first person to notice it, and I'm going to sound the alarm, and I'm going to advocate for myself. So also, I would just say to all individuals who find themselves in that position, like, if you have the strength, your obligation is to advocate for yourself, because when you advocate for yourself, you are advocating for everyone. Sorry, passionate message.
I love that. I love that you put in there, if you have the strength, because sometimes being a minority is so stressful. And, this is a term that we're starting to use more and more, is minority stress, for a variety of reasons. And especially with Black Lives Matter and racial tensions that we're feeling, this term is coming to be more in use. And that's a real, that's a very researched thing, that if you are a minority, if you're the canary and you're not being attended to, you're not being listened to, that this environment is toxic, then you don't have as much recourse, right? Your body is more stressed out. You're more likely to fall ill or be more vulnerable to physical ailments, mental health ailments, all relational ailments. And so this is no laughing matter, right? This shows up in people's lives in very real day-to-day experiences. So I'm glad that you mentioned, self-care first, and then if advocacy can be part of self-care, that's amazing. That's great. So,
I think it's a tricky thing. Have we got a second to discuss that? Because like my transition in society, I mean, I had this internal thing going on my whole life. The easiest way I can put it for myself, like, if I were to just tell my story very briefly, it's that I was in chronic psychological pain for 46 years, right? And when I was finally able to embrace myself, find a model that allowed me to say, oh, this is who I am, this is how I function, I can embrace all these things, I can go be myself in the world, it was so incredibly freeing. I'm released from a lot of that internal psychological pain, but also a huge surprise for me is that the pain of being a minority, right? Like, there is a pain associated with that. There's a stress associated with that. I'm articulate. I'm educated. As a trans woman, I'm so incredibly lucky, right? Like, I have a good job. I have all these things that so many of my sisters don't have because we're a very endangered minority. I'm super lucky. And I feel a real responsibility to be advocating. I get out into society and a little microaggression happens or someone accidentally dead names me, and it's time for me to stand up for myself, and I'm just exhausted, right? This happens all day long. Like all day long, I could spend the entire day, every day, educating everyone about transgender issues, but that's just exhausting. People ask kind of dumb questions all the time, or they want to know this, or they don't understand that. And yes, I want people to know. And also, I'm exhausted. And, oh, thank you so much for telling me that you misgendered me until you actually came and talked to me in person. I didn't really want to know that person misgendered me. That's very painful to me to hear that person couldn't just take my word for it, that, hey, I'm a woman. They had to come see me and decide, do I really want to know that's how people function? That they won't believe me until they see me, and then they'll evaluate whether or not I seem feminine enough. I know that happens, but that's not a thing I want to know. And all day long, I'm needing to say, oh, that's probably not a thing you should say to any other transgender people. Maybe do your own work about me without telling me about it. It's an incredible toll that I think is very hard, and actually that I was isolated from by being hidden, and now I'm not hidden, and my body is actually a battleground, right? Thank heavens the Supreme Court, in a surprising majority, ruled that no, it's not okay to discriminate against transgender individuals or any type of LGBTQ individuals at work based on that identity or orientation. Yay! But there was a big fight, and the president was arguing that yes, indeed, we should be able to fire Mandy just for being who she is. It's a different thing, I would just say, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for the individuals in the Black Lives Matter movement, because their bodies are the battleground, right? That's a thing I didn't really understand fully until I experienced it. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you bring up the reality that transgender women are one of the segments of society that are most in danger from violent crime. And if you add another intersection to that, Black transgender women are the highest statistically in danger of violent crime. So that's very sobering. And why a lot of, I oftentimes, people say, well, let politics and, leave politics out of it. You can't leave politics out of people's lives. And this is why, I take a lot of passionate, positions about how we vote, and that it's social justice should be, I think, a big part of how people consider their vote, not just economics or, whatever reasons people tend to go down party lines, but to really consider social justice as part of how your vote is informed, right? So, all right. So given all of that, and before we pivot maybe to HIV talk, because I'd love to get some of your education on that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. What have I asked you about your particular personal story, or maybe some thoughts that maybe you want to give to people in your position, as far as resources or ideas or thoughts about how these, how it can get better and how, I don't know, just kind of best care practices in regards to if somebody's in your position, that you were in several years ago.
The It Gets Better movement, that whole idea, that's incredibly important. It does get better. And the only other thing I think I would say is community. Community is so important. I couldn't have made it through this journey without a beautiful, empowered community of transgender individuals who there was no one else who could validate my story, right? There was no model for me to see. There's no movie I can go see about someone like myself. I needed to go meet people who said, oh yeah, me too. That me too, that statement of me too in a community, to say we have a shared experience. You are not alone. You're valid. This is a thing that happens to us. This is how we experience our lives. That community is so vital. So I guess my advice to anyone would be, Like if you find yourself struggling, it is worth it to find community. It's worth any kind of sacrifice you have to make to get in touch with your community. Like there won't be someone else, for many of us, there won't be someone else to understand. You might not even understand until you get with your community. And that's where all of a sudden we can build together a vocabulary for talking about what's happening. It's so hard to, I mean, it's very much like trauma. You know, the journey out of trauma is this thing happened to me and I don't know how to talk about it, right? And eventually, from a therapeutic perspective, eventually we get the trauma out of the body and out of a space where it's experiential and into a place where we actually have a narrative about it. Here is what happened. I can think about it now. I can look at it and I can work with it cognitively now. And that's so important in a journey around orientation or identity. You know, I thought I was straight as could be, and it turns out I'm queer in every way, you know, right? Like I thought I wasn't gay, but I'm actually all the way gay, right? So, you know, it's so funny. I guess I would just say community is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And that reminds me of a point that I was going to make earlier when you talked about, you know, opening up the book and there's no pictures, and how many of us who are cisgender and heterosexual see modeling all the time, all over the place, right? Like we're swimming in heteronormative, you know, society. And so we kind of see people kiss in movies, like you said, you know, or we get to see people have relational conflict, or we get to see our own family members interact. And when you have a blank slate, and why, like to your point, diversity is so important, if you don't have role models that you can identify with, it's almost impossible. Like I say, there's not even a language, there's no words, you don't know how to describe it. That was so incredibly poignant how you pointed those types of concepts out.
And without the language, right, like without the structure that you can place all of your experiences in, without some kind of structure to place your experiences in, how is a person to understand it? My own personal experience, right, like it took me a long time to realize that admiration and like, what's the word I'm looking for? Am I in love with that person, or do I want to be like that person, right? That these are different emotions, right? Because I'm a lesbian transgender woman. Some women I wanted to be like, that was admiration, and some women I wanted to be with, and that was I want a romantic relationship with that person. I don't necessarily want to be like them. I want to be with them. And I couldn't tell that those things were different, because you know what I never felt? I didn't feel the same kind of I want to be like that person when I looked at a male, right? Like because it wasn't the gender that I was. And so all of that, like that being drawn towards someone, I just assumed, you know, the vocabulary I had is, well, that's love, right? And all of a sudden, you know, I finally get this new structure, and I'm like, oh, this is actually a whole bunch of things. There's a whole bunch of different colors and shades that I can paint with now that were all there in the box. I just didn't, you know, they were just all one big crayon. You know? And so, anyway, sorry, you were transitioning.
No, you're fine. And
actually, I'm the one who transitioned.
My transitions don't come at quite the cost. So, but I would love to invite you at this point, if you're comfortable, to share some music with us. I think.
Oh, let me play you. Let me play you my coming out song.
I would love it.
My guitar, Emily. I'm gonna adjust the screen a little bit,
okay.
And scoot back just a hair so that maybe you can kind of see the whole thing.
I can see you. You look fabulous.
So, yeah, I thought, you know, this song kind of came to me in the spring. I was sitting around looking out at my yard, and it was full of flowers, really beautiful flowers. They were all yellow, and they were all dandelions, but they're pretty. And, you know, the neighbors were kind of like, would you like some help removing those from your yard? And I kind of didn't really want to remove them, you know. I was like, it's the easiest flowers to grow, you know. I'm super happy about it. And then I was, you know, also kind of thinking about how that's a message I got most of my life is, you know, could you maybe remove who you are from yourself? And so so that turned into this little song. Oh, but I've got to get it in tune. I thought it was, but I think my little heater here has.
You're the most fascinating person to watch tune your instruments, by the way.
Well, as a musician, and maybe it's just my quirkiness, I just never can play a guitar in the tuning that it was told to be in, right? Like I'm always like, what tuning do you want to be on, you know? So, and then I'm like, oh, what tuning does this song want to be in? You know, it wants a different sort of tuning. So I use a lot of altered tunings. Dandelion, dandelion, eat them fresh or make them wine. Help the bees make honey, rest the roots for tea. Send your wishes floating on the breeze. Oh, but dandelions on the lawn, folks see them there. They want them gone. It's a noxious weed, a ghost in the machine. Mucking up their lawns of perfect green. Dandelion, dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion. Well, I guess I'm like a dandelion. My colors don't fit the design. Just a little bright to keep from being seen. Oh, but ain't it yellow makes Kentucky bluegrass green? Mm-hmm. Dandelion, dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion. Well, maybe all of us are dandelions, little kisses of sunshine. If you let us grow just the way we please, oh, we'll crown your head with gold for all to see. Bring all your wishes, come and set them free. Yeah, I said bring all your wishes, come and set them free. Dandelion, dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion, dandelion. Dandelion, dandelion. Oh, that was fun.
That's super fun. I love
Oh, thanks. Let me move back a little closer. Thanks for letting me play. That was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank
Have a
you.
little shout out to myself.
Goodness.
That you can find me at MandyLynnDanzig.com or any of the social media. My name is actually a pun. I got to pick my own name. I picked a pun. So I play mandolin as well, which I didn't do tonight. So Mandy Lynn is like
I
A
love it.
pun. So I figured, why not? Why not? I didn't really pick Mandy. It just sort of landed on me, and then I thought, what am I going to do with this? And so that's what I did with it.
I love it. Well, and just so the listeners know, it's Mandy's music that I choose for both the intro and outros to this podcast. So that's been, and I've used your music before for other podcasts that I've done as well in the past. I've loved your music for a long time, and your ex-wife as well. So you're both very talented and do beautiful work. So
Oh, thanks.
awesome. All right, so let's pivot really quickly. I know I'm taking up way too much of your time, but I really appreciate it. HIV. So give us your soapbox. This is your work. This is what you're doing, HIV prevention. What's the latest and greatest news about how we're fighting this disease? What's out there? What are the treatments? What are the options? What are the preventative measures, etc.?
Oh, yay. I'm so glad you asked. All right. This is one of my current passions. It's why I'm at the job I'm at. We can make sure that this could be the last generation that has to deal with HIV. We do not have to have this disease. We have all the tools we need to get rid of it. So let me talk about that for just a moment. HIV is a disease that seeks out people who have been traumatized. Granted, anyone, let's be clear, anyone can get HIV, but individuals who've been through trauma or who have mental health issues or substance abuse issues are much more likely to get it, because those things, generally a person's been in a place where life is more difficult, and HIV kind of seeks out those spots. So we have no reason for anyone to die of HIV anymore. This is miraculous. We have treatments that work 100% effectively. We have no cure, but the medications that we have now have reached a point where they can fully suppress the virus to the point where it is not detectable in the body. Now, problematically, a handful of copies of that virus go somewhere deep inside and they hide out. And if you ever go off the medications, why, they come rushing out. We can't get rid of the infection. But one of the things we've discovered across hundreds of thousands of exposures, sex acts in general, is that there has never been a transmission of the HIV virus from someone who is taking their medications and whose virus is undetectable to another person. Never, not a single one. So if individuals who have HIV are able to get the medications, which I will mention cost anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000 a month, then in general, for almost everyone, they are not going to spread that virus on to anyone else. Now, from the preventative side, we've also discovered that one of the medications that was developed for HIV, Truvada, can be utilized to prevent infection. So I'm going to speak in turn as a good citizen and then out of turn as an even better citizen. So this is called pre-exposure prophylaxis. And essentially a person who happens to know they're at risk for HIV. So a person who, for instance, is a partner with someone with HIV can take PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and have almost no chance of catching the virus, even if it wasn't fully suppressed. So you see, we have ways to suppress this on both sides. A person who is active sexually and is, for whatever reason, having unprotected sex can take PrEP and is much less likely to get it. Now, there's some information that is not available in the U.S., and it turns out we probably, some research is indicating we probably don't even have to take PrEP all of the time. Now, I'm not recommending any of you out there on PrEP take your meds, because if you have it available. But one of the nice things is if for any reason it ever becomes less available, one of the things we're finding is there's a protocol where if you're able to plan your exposures, you can kind of take a smaller number of doses for a day or two before and a day or two after and have the same effect as taking it all of the time. So we have all these remarkable tools. In the next 3 to 5 years, we have several injectable HIV medications coming online. So these are medications that instead of taking them every day, you take them once a month through an injection. This is super helpful because some clients have very chaotic lives. And so I came out as transgender. Just a little fun fact about transgender women: I have medicine to take every day for the rest of my life, right? Like that's how I manage a physical transition. and gave me a tremendous amount of respect for individuals living with HIV. Taking medications regularly every day without fail, that's quite a feat. You know, we humans aren't really, our brains aren't built for that. And so the idea that we're coming online with medications that can be administered once every month and likely eventually once every 3 months, this is incredible. Now, one of the problems that we're facing in HIV is that 25% of the individuals who have HIV do not know they have it. So we have to find these individuals. So anybody out there listening, I'm going to give you a little challenge. Next time you go to your doctor and your doctor fails to offer you an HIV test as part of your standard health screening, if you have the courage to say, hey, doctor, why didn't you offer me HIV screening? Then your doctor will probably say, well, I didn't think you needed it. And then you can say, I don't know if you knew this, but the recommendations are that everyone gets it. That's the recommendations from the American Medical Association. This is best practice. Everyone gets screened for HIV because anyone could have it. Now, I've worked in an HIV clinic for a long time, and let me tell you, lots of people are exposed that don't know they are. You think you know everything about the person who you have sex with, but you probably don't. That's like a scary fact of life. And so you could be exposed even if you think you're not, right? And then our society has all these assumptions about who's exposed. I know, for instance, a transgender woman who went to her provider. Now, transgender women are the most likely demographic to end up with HIV. I mean, 66% of them have been raped. Many, especially Black transgender women in the South, like there are no jobs. It's extremely difficult to find a good job. And many of them are forced into sex work for survival. So this is one reason that there's a high, that the HIV is very high in that population. Like I said, it seeks out trauma, and so it seeks out minorities who experience a lot of trauma as well in a differential way. Well, I knew a trans woman who went to her doctor and said, I'd like some screening for STDs, right? And the doctor was like, well, who are you, wanted to, like, you don't need to know who I'm having sex with, right? Like, that's a silly question. Your doctor doesn't need to ask that. Your doctor should be screening you for HIV, whether or not they think you're at risk. And you're allowed to opt out. You're always allowed to opt out. But if you are able, this is one of in our state has a campaign right now that is about to launch. In fact, if you live in Utah, you might see some media around this fairly soon, called Getting to Zero. And one of the key components that's missing is we just can't get enough HIV testing going. We need everyone tested everywhere. We can find everyone. We can treat everyone. We can get rid of this disease. We can do with HIV what we did with smallpox. So, I mean, that's the big picture. The small picture is, how do I help someone who, for instance, has bipolar or who is in the midst of a methamphetamine addiction? How do I help that person stay on treatment? That's the work I do on a daily basis. And I'm sharing with everyone the work they can do on a once a year at the doctor's office basis. So, right. Well, I'm happy to answer questions. What questions do you have?
Well, the first question I have is, it seems pretty cost prohibitive for those who already have HIV to be paying $2,000 to $6,000 a month, for these medications that you started out talking about. So is that something that most health insurance covers, or how are people getting that covered?
So I have bad news and good news. The good news, yay, the excellent news is that in the state of Utah and in most other states in the U.S., I can't speak authoritatively about that, but heavens, we're in Utah, so we can do it here probably. In very conservative Utah, probably most people are managing it. If somebody wants medications and they're motivated, they can get them. There's a federal legislation called the Ryan White Treatment and Care Act, named after Ryan White, a teenager who contracted HIV through hemophilia and was a huge champion for the rights of people living with HIV. This actually pays for medications and medical treatment for individuals who cannot otherwise afford it. And really, more than any other healthcare program in the U.S., except I will mention tuberculosis, it really doesn't have a gap in the middle where people can't get care. Tuberculosis is an interesting thing because we've, as a society, decided, well, that one we want to really keep the lid on. If we find out you have it, we're going to make you treat it. If you won't treat it, we're going to quarantine you. It's kind of interesting that there's a stigma about HIV still, right? Because HIV, initially the population in Africa, in African countries where it's very prevalent, it's a heterosexual disease. But because the population it got loose in initially in the US was gay men, right? Like there's this stigma around, and then because also another primary transmission vector is intravenous drug use. If you share needles, there's this idea that it's only undesirable people. We've seen with COVID kind of this idea over and over that why don't we let the undesirable people die? Well, this is no new kind of idea. That's exactly what happened from the start of the HIV epidemic right on through right now. There are people who are like, well, we don't want those people in our society. Why don't we just let them go? Like, well, that's a great way to get a pandemic or an infectious disease to go roaring through a society. Everyone's at risk when the weakest among us or the least advantaged among us is at risk.
Thank you.
So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And I appreciate bringing in kind of different contexts for people to kind of understand what we're talking about. Okay, so I would love to have you sign off with a song.
Sign off with a song? Oh my goodness, What should I play?
I don't know.
Can I play you a fiddle tune?
I would love a fiddle tune.
Well, okay. Have you got time for me to introduce it? Just a little teeny introduction?
I have all the time in the world. I'm worried about your time.
You have all the time in the world. Oh, I'm fine. You know, we're here. It's nighttime. We're in the dark of winter. I'd like to just play you a little fiddle tune. And maybe I could tell you, I was in therapy for like the third time because something just felt really wrong for me. And I look back and I see it was really, I'm transgender, and I was really looking for someone to help me find a way to talk about that. And my therapist said to me, hey, Mandy, I'm noticing you're deeply disconnected from your body. And I'm wondering if you might try feeling some emotions in your body and connecting your emotions with your mind. And in my mind, I was like, well, that's a thing I tell people to do all the time in therapy. And out of my mouth came the words, no way. And I thought, well, okay, that's not intellectually honest at all now, is it, Mandy?
But we make the worst clients, right? Isn't it like doctors make the worst patients and therapists make the worst clients?
So I was hugely resistant to this, and she said, well, here, why don't you read this book? She had recommended the book Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach, and she pointed me to a couple of chapters in there and said, maybe just pick an exercise out of here that you like. And I listened to it on the way to teach at Moab Folk Camp. I listened to several hours of the book, and there was one exercise called Taking Refuge in the Dharma of Nature. And the one place I had always felt peaceful and at home in my body was when I was in the Utah desert. And so I thought, okay, this is a thing I can do. I'll just go sit in someplace beautiful in the Red Rock Wilderness, and I will wait and see what comes up in my body. Like that is the only place that's the only place and the only way it felt safe for me to try this. And so I had a day at Arches. I got to Delicate Arch. It's on the license plate in Utah. I got to that at sunrise. I think I sat there for 2.5 hours, just watching the light change, and watching what was happening in my body. And then I went up to the top of the park and I hiked the primitive loop. And then when I got somewhere beautiful, I would just stop and I would wait and see what came up in my body. And I started mentally hearing this melody, and I was, just was kind of in my awareness that this was happening. And towards the end of the day, I went for a hike up to Broken Arch, and the trail goes right up under the arch. And as you get above the arch, you can see through the arch to all the beautiful red rock one direction, and then off in the other direction is the beautiful snow-capped mountains off in the distance. And this melody just kind of snapped into place. And so I ran back to the car and I got my fiddle, and I came back and I was like, well, I don't want to forget this. It's really pretty. And so I recorded it, and then I came home and I was like, I don't think I've ever heard this anywhere, because that's always a worry as a musician. Am I just like playing something I've heard? So no, indeed I hadn't. And I had this just deep sense that it was like coming from the deepest part of my own soul. So I think this was the moment I sat down and listened for my own voice inside my own body. This is the tune that came out. So I named it Mandy's Waltz. Let me grab a fiddle for you.
Thank you, Mandy. What a beautiful introduction. So meaningful. Goodness.
Oh, maybe can I stand all the way back here? That might. I'll come sit a little closer.
Whatever you'd like to do.
Gotta tighten my bow a little bit. Want to be totally ready for this.
Wow, thank you.
Well, thanks.
Your body spoke quite eloquently.
I'm fond of her. Thanks so much. It's been so much fun.
Mandy, this has been very powerful. Thank you for sharing your story, your wisdom, your experience, your professionalism. It's just been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And let's get together and jam sometime soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Thanks.
All right. Take care. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls hide Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Något ich geschehen alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Något ich geschehen alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland.